In the final chapter of the Superposed Look tech story, let's talk about the variant looks. And this video also is a summary, because the Asian people invented so many different types. After studying many of them, I made this summary. Meanwhile, this time, I put these different looks and trigger systems in categories based on the appearance of the looks. So finally, I got these 3 different types. The first type, I want to call it the sliding single lock type. As usual, I will make a simplified schematic. The feature is on the amount of lock and its mechanism. Typically, there is only one lock plate and the corresponding parts like the cork, freezing, and trigger, but there are many vent holes drilled in the barrel. So in order to fire every cartridge that is put in the branch of the barrel, there is a reel set under the barrel. So the shooter can fire the first cartridge and pull back the lock plate and reload the premium powder. By the way, if using the Superposed load percussion lock firearm, the operator can even equip the all primers on the nipple before firing, and make the cork or hammer and the freezing get ready. Then he can fire the next cartridge. So he can repeat the steps again and again. Meanwhile, typically, this type of a system applied on flintlock and percussion lock repeater firearms. In addition, there was a design which used this kind of superposed load system type in 1777, the Belton flintlock, which was created by Resident Joseph Belton, who lived in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. He had offered his design to the Continental Congress in 1777, and even later was unable to sell the design to the British Army a year after the American Revolution. Since there is very little documentation about the Belton's design, we might have no way of knowing more about what happened later. The second type is a fixed multi-lock with a single or multi-trigger. Compared with the other 2 types, this type should be the commonest type, and maybe this was the oldest type as well in history. Not only was it used in matchlock and wheel lock repeating firearms, but also was used in flintlock and percussion lock firearms, plus the Asian Indian superposed load musket that we talked about in the chapter 2 of this story was exactly this type. In matchlock, most of them that used this type usually were similar with this Indian musket example. The only difference might be that in some superposed load matchlock firearms, they can have more levers, as known as the triggers of a matchlock, in order to shoot more cartridges. In percussion lock and flintlock, most of them were similar in mechanism, but there also were some percussion lock guns that used some special structure in order to have a better repeating shooting effect, which might be close to the early semi-auto rifles shooting effect. And then, the trigger can control every hammer to fire the cartridge in turn. In contrast, the superposed load wheel lock firearms were more complex in mechanism. The last one is a kind of composite lock type, because this kind of muskets didn't have the typical looks and the mechanisms of previous 2 types, and at the same time, it also mixed some other elements. So finally, I decided to call it the composite lock type. Here is an example that I found. You can see that it has a normal percussion lock musket. In other words, this special superposed load musket kept the original percussion nipple and added a new part, which has a long enough rod, and the hammer can firstly hit the front primer because the rod is longer. It can be over the original nipple. Thus, when the first and the front primer is hit, the back primer doesn't hit, and the first cartridge can be fired successfully. Then, release the rod, and the spring energy can turn it over. Now, the hammer can hit the primer on the percussion nipple, known as the original nipple, on the normal version percussion lock musket. Okay, this is this video, and thank you for watching. Hope you can like this video. Have a good day. See you next time. Bye.